A desperate, skeletal mustang collapses at a rural farmhouse, barely clinging to life. What the homeowner discovers about this wild horse will expose a shocking tale of cruelty, corruption, and an unexpected fight for justice that nobody saw coming. The sound of something heavy collapsing against his front porch jolted James Morgan awake. Living alone on the outskirts of Nevada's high desert had its perks: peace, quiet, and a night sky untouched by light pollution. But it also meant unexpected visitors were rare and often unwelcome. Grabbing his flashlight and pulling on his boots, James cautiously approached the door. The wind howled outside, carrying dust and the promise of a storm. Through the window, he could make out a large shape sprawled across his porch. Not a person, something bigger. When he opened the door, the beam of his flashlight revealed a horrifying sight. A wild mustang, its ribs protruding painfully through its dull coat, had collapsed on his porch. The horse's breathing was shallow, its eyes half closed in exhaustion. This wasn't just a tired horse. This animal was starving to death. "Jesus Christ," James whispered, immediately kneeling beside the animal. The mustang flinched, but lacked the strength to move away. Its coat, which should have been a rich chestnut, was covered in dust and marred with cuts. Some were fresh, others partially healed. But most disturbing was how severely underweight the animal was, a living skeleton with skin stretched over bones. James had grown up around horses. His father had been a ranch hand, and before moving to his isolated home, James had worked at several equestrian centers. He knew horses, loved them even, and he knew that wild mustangs, especially in Nevada, were supposed to be protected. Something was very wrong here. Careful not to startle the weakened animal, James hurried inside to call the local veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Martinez. Despite the late hour, Sarah answered on the third ring. "I've got a dying mustang on my front porch," James explained without preamble. "Wild one. Never seen an animal this malnourished that was still breathing." "I'll be there in 20, Sarah replied, the sound of keys jingling in the background. While waiting, James filled a shallow bowl with water and approached the horse slowly, talking in a low, soothing voice. "Easy there, buddy. Just some water for you. That's all." The mustang's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice. A good sign. With tremendous effort, the horse lifted its head slightly. James held the bowl to its cracked lips, and the animal drank weakly. By the time Sarah's truck pulled up, James had managed to get a blanket under the horse's head and had been steadily offering small amounts of water. The vet's expression turned grave as soon as her headlights illuminated the scene. "This is not natural starvation," she said after her initial examination, voice tight with anger. "This horse has been deliberately starved, James, and these marks, some are from fighting with other horses, but these straight ones, these were made by humans." James felt something cold settle in his stomach. Who would do this to a wild mustang? Sarah shook her head, administering fluids through an IV she'd set up. "That's what concerns me. Wild mustangs are federally protected. They're supposed to be managed by the Bureau of Land Management. This one has a BLM Freeze brand. See here?" She pointed to a barely visible mark on the horse's neck. This horse was processed through a holding facility at some point. "Can he make it?" James asked, watching as the horse's breathing seemed slightly less labored after the fluids began to work. "It's touch and go. I've seen horses come back from worse, but not many," Sarah admitted. "The next 48 hours will tell. We need to get him to my clinic, but moving him right now might kill him. I'm going to stabilize him here first." As they worked through the night, James kept thinking about what Sarah had said. A BLM-branded mustang, starved nearly to death, with marks that suggested human cruelty. The Bureau of Land Management was tasked with protecting these wild horses, not harming them. By dawn, the mustang's condition had improved enough that they risked moving him to Sarah's clinic. As they carefully loaded him into her specialized trailer, James made a decision. "I want to find out where he came from," he told Sarah. "This isn't right." Sarah's expression was grim as she secured the trailer doors. "Be careful, James. If someone did this deliberately, they won't want you asking questions." "I've got nothing better to do," James replied, his jaw set. What he didn't say was that the look in the Mustang's eyes, a mixture of fear and desperate hope, had stirred something in him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As Sarah drove away with the Mustang, James went inside to make some calls. The BLM office would be opening soon, and that freeze brand was his first clue. Little did he know that this emaciated horse would lead him into a web of corruption that reached far beyond the desert and threatened not just the wild Mustangs, but the very land they called home. The Bureau of Land Management office in Elko County was a modest single-story building with a dusty parking lot and an American flag that had seen better days. James arrived just as they opened, the morning sun already heating the desert air to an uncomfortable degree. Inside, the fluorescent lighting and beige walls created an atmosphere of bureaucratic tedium. A young woman with dark-rimmed glasses looked up from her computer as James approached the counter. "Can I help you?" she asked, her name tag identifying her as Melissa. "I hope so," James said, pulling out his phone to show her the pictures he'd taken of the Mustang and its freeze brand. "I found this horse on my property last night. He's in bad shape, starved, abused, but he has a BLM freeze brand." Melissa's professional smile faltered as she looked at the images. That's not normal," she said, her voice dropping. "May I see a closer image of the brand?" James zoomed in on the clearest photo of the brand. The markings were distinctive, a series of angles and lines that looked like a code rather than a traditional brand. "This is definitely one of ours," Melissa confirmed, typing something into her computer. "Give me a minute to look this up." As she searched, James glanced around the office. Posters depicting healthy wild horses running across landscapes decorated the walls, alongside maps of herd management areas and information about adoption and programs. The disconnect between these idyllic images and the reality of the suffering animal he'd found was jarring. "That's strange," Melissa said, frowning at her screen. "According to our records, this horse, a stallion actually, was part of a group gathered from the Silver King herd management area last year. But it says here he was adopted." "Adopted? By whom?" "I can't give you that information," she replied automatically, then hesitated, looking again at the photos. "But this doesn't make sense. Adopted horses are subject to follow-up inspections. No horse should end up in this condition." "Is there someone else I could talk to? Someone who oversees the adoption program?" Melissa glanced towards a closed office door. "Mr. Haskell is our regional coordinator, but he's in a meeting. Maybe you could leave your contact information?" Before James could respond, the office door opened, and a man in his 50s emerged, wearing a BLM uniform with an air of authority. His conversation with another man in an expensive-looking suit halted when he noticed James and Melissa. "Everything all right, Melissa?" the uniformed man asked. "Mr. Haskell, this gentleman found a Mustang with one of our freeze brands. It's in poor condition," she explained, her voice careful. Richard Haskell approached, his expression neutral but eyes sharp. "Is that right? May I see?" James showed him the photos. Unlike Melissa, Haskell's expression remained impassive. "Unfortunate. Sometimes adopted horses end up abandoned or neglected. Where did you find it?" "On my property, near the Calico Mountains. But according to your colleague, this horse was supposedly adopted and should have been subject to inspections." Haskell nodded. "Yes, we do perform inspections for the first year. After that, the horse becomes private property. Not much we can do then." He handed the phone back. "I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. If you'd like, we can arrange to pick up the animal." "That won't be necessary," James interrupted. "He's receiving veterinary care." Something flickered across Haskell's face. "I see. Well, these things happen. Not everyone is cut out for horse ownership. I'd be happy to take your information and look into it." The man in the suit, who had been standing quietly nearby, suddenly spoke up. "Is there a problem, Richard?" Haskell turned. "No problem, Mr. Whitmore. Just a concerned citizen." To James he added, "This is Carson Whitmore, one of our stakeholders in the region." Whitmore was tall and lean, with silver hair and a desert tan that spoke of time outdoors despite his formal attire. His handshake was firm as he introduced himself to James. "I couldn't help overhearing. You found one of the wild ones in bad shape?" "Yes," James replied, studying the man. "There was something calculated about his interest. Nearly dead on my doorstep." "Shame," Whitmore said. "These mustangs are a symbol of the West. My family's been ranching in Nevada for generations. We've always had a complicated relationship with the wild herds. But no one wants to see animals suffer." James felt a tension in the room he couldn't quite place. "Do you have many dealings with the mustangs, Mr. Whitmore?" "My company, Whitmore Enterprises, helps the BLM with certain aspects of the wild horse program," he replied smoothly. "Private-public partnership, more efficient that way." Haskell cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore has been instrumental in finding innovative solutions for our wild horse management challenges." The words sounded rehearsed, and James found himself wondering about the nature of this partnership. "If you leave your information," Haskell continued, "I'll look into this specific case, though I should warn you, if the adoption was finalized over a year ago, there may not be much we can do officially." James provided his details, but as he left the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Neither Haskell nor Whitmore had seemed particularly surprised or disturbed by the condition of the horse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their concern felt performative rather than genuine. In his truck, James called Sarah's clinic for an update on the Mustang. Her assistant informed him that the horse was stable but still critical. They were cautiously optimistic. As he was about to drive away, he noticed Whitmore exiting the building, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Haskell. Both men looked in his direction, and Whitmore pulled out his phone. James decided to wait. 20 minutes later, Whitmore left in a black SUV with tinted windows. James followed at a distance, curious about this stakeholder and his interest in wild horses. The SUV headed not toward the town, but deeper into the desert, toward an area James knew was largely undeveloped, except for a few mining operations and, if he remembered correctly, some of the BLM's horse-holding facilities. His instincts told him there was more to this story than an unfortunate case of neglect, and James had learned long ago to trust his instincts. Following Whitmore's SUV at a careful distance, James found himself driving deeper into the Nevada backcountry. The paved road eventually gave way to gravel, and then to a rough dirt track that tested even his truck's four-wheel drive. Dust clouds billowed behind Whitmore's vehicle, forcing James to hang back further than he would have liked. After nearly an hour, the SUV turned off onto an unmarked road partially hidden by scrub brush. James drove past, then pulled over once he was out of sight, grabbing his binoculars from the glove compartment, a habit from his days tracking wildlife. For conservation studies, he hiked up a nearby ridge that offered a view of the area. What he saw below made his blood run cold. Sprawled across the desert floor was what could only be described as a holding facility, but unlike any BLM facility he'd ever seen documented. A series of corrals stretched across several acres, containing what appeared to be hundreds of wild horses. Even from this distance, James could see that the animals were packed tightly together, with minimal shelter from the scorching sun. Most disturbing were the conditions. The corrals appeared severely overcrowded, with no visible hay or proper water troughs. Through his binoculars, James could make out ribs on many of the horses, not as severe as the mustang that had collapsed on his porch, but clearly underfed. "What the hell is this place?" he muttered to himself. Whitmore's SUV had stopped at a prefabricated office building. The man emerged and was greeted by two individuals in what looked like security uniforms. No BLM logos were visible on anything, not the vehicles, buildings, or the guards' attire. This didn't look like any government operation James had ever seen. He snapped several photos with his phone, zooming in as much as the camera would allow. The quality wasn't great, but it was evidence. As he watched, a large truck with a cattle trailer pulled up. The workers began loading horses into it, thin, dejected animals that barely resisted. James knew enough about the wild horse program to understand that roundups and holding facilities were controversial but legal parts of the BLM's management strategy. But those facilities were supposed to provide adequate care until the horses could be adopted or relocated to long-term pastures. Whatever was happening here seemed far outside those guidelines. As he was about to retreat, movement caught his eye. A group of men were dragging something away from one of the corrals. With a sickening realization, James understood it was a dead horse. Rather than properly disposing of the carcass, they simply dragged it behind a small hill, out of sight from the main facility. James had seen enough. He carefully made his way back to his truck, his mind racing. Whatever connection Whitmore had to the BLM, this facility didn't appear to be following any federal guidelines for animal welfare. The question was, did the BLM know about these conditions? Was Haskell aware, or worse, complicit? On the drive back, James called Sarah Martinez. "How's our patient?" he asked when she answered. "Holding his own," Sarah replied. "I had to put in a feeding tube. He's too weak to eat properly, but he's fighting. What about you? Learn anything at the BLM?" James hesitated, then decided to trust her. "I think I found where he came from, and it's bad, Sarah. Really bad." He described what he'd seen at the facility. Sarah listened silently, but he could sense her growing anger. "That can't be legal," she finally said. "The BLM has to maintain certain standards for holding facilities. The thing is, I'm not sure this is an official BLM facility. There were no logos, no government vehicles, just Whitmore's company apparently running the show." But Whitmore? Carson Whitmore, the mining magnate? James was surprised. "You know him?" "Everyone in this county knows Whitmore Enterprises. They've been buying up land rights all over Nevada for years. Mining claims, water rights, you name it. There were rumors they were getting into the wild horse business somehow, but I never knew the details." This was an angle James hadn't considered. What would a mining company want with wild horses? "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but Whitmore has friends in high places, state politicians, federal agencies. People say he's untouchable." When James arrived back at his house, the sun was beginning to set. He transferred the photos from his phone to his computer and examined them more closely. Despite the distance and poor quality, they clearly showed the overcrowded conditions and malnourished state of the horses. He opened his browser and began researching Carson Whitmore and his connections to the BLM. News articles mentioned a private-public partnership for innovative wild horse management solutions, but details were frustratingly vague. One article from 2 years ago mentioned that Whitmore Enterprises had secured a contract to manage overflow holding facilities when federal corrals reached capacity, a common occurrence in recent years as wild horse populations grew. Another Peace mentioned Whitmore's significant donations to several politicians who oversaw committees related to public land management and BLM budgets. It was all circumstantial, but it painted a picture of a man with both the means and opportunity to potentially exploit the wild horse program. As night fell, James's phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Mr. Morgan?" A woman's voice, hushed and nervous. "This is Melissa from the BLM office this morning." James sat up straighter. "Yes, I remember." "I shouldn't be calling you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But after you left, I did some digging. That horse you found, something's not right with the records. The adoption paperwork has signatures, but there are inconsistencies." "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Dates that don't match up. Inspection reports filed for visits that couldn't have happened because the inspector was on leave. And it's not just your horse. There's a whole group from that gather that have similar issues." James felt a chill. "Who adopted them? Whitmore?" "Not directly, no. The paperwork shows different adopters, but when I cross-referenced, 3 of them don't even exist. Fake names, addresses that lead nowhere. The others are all employees of subsidiaries of Whitmore Enterprises." "Melissa, I have to go," she interrupted urgently. "They watch everything here. Just be careful. Haskell and Whitmore were really interested in you after you left. They were asking questions." The line went dead before James could respond. He sat in the darkening room, the pieces slowly fitting together. Whitmore's company adopting horses through employees and fake identities. A hidden facility with substandard conditions. A starving mustang with signs of abuse finding its way to his doorstep. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the mustang that had collapsed on his porch was just the tip of a much larger, darker operation. And now, it seemed, those responsible knew he was asking questions. James checked the locks on his doors, a habit he'd rarely bothered with before, and loaded the old rifle he kept for emergencies. Something told him that pursuing this further would be dangerous, but the image of that mustang fighting for its life in Sarah's clinic kept him from walking away. Some things were worth the risk. Morning arrived with the harsh clarity of the desert sun. James had slept poorly, his mind churning with questions about Whitmore, the BLM, and the suffering horses he'd witnessed. His coffee was still brewing when his phone rang. Sarah Martinez. "He's awake," she said without preamble. "Our mustang, he actually tried to stand this morning." Relief washed over James. "That's incredible. I didn't think he'd make it through the night." "Neither did I," Sarah admitted. "But he's got fight in him. These wild ones usually do." She paused. "I thought you might want to come see him. He seems calmer when you're around." "I'll be there in an hour," James promised. At the veterinary clinic, the change in the mustang was subtle but significant. He remained painfully thin, but his eyes were more alert, tracking James as he entered the stall. Sarah had set up a specialized sling to help support the horse's weight while preventing pressure sores. "I've seen a lot of neglect cases," Sarah said, checking the IV fluids, "but this is something else. The blood work shows long-term malnutrition, and those marks on his hide, some are from fighting with other horses, but others." She pointed to several uniform marks along the mustang's flank. "These were made with something like a cattle prod. Repeatedly." James felt anger rising in his chest. "Who would do this?" "Someone who doesn't see these animals as living creatures," Sarah replied grimly. "Just inventory." She hesitated, then added, "I've been making some calls to colleagues. No one wants to talk on the record, but there are rumors about the private holding facilities, whispers that horses are disappearing." "Disappearing to where?" Sarah's expression was troubled. "Some say Mexico or Canada, to slaughterhouses. Horse slaughter is illegal in the US, but the meat fetches a good price internationally." The implication hit James like a physical blow. You think Whitmore is selling these horses for slaughter, but that's illegal for BLM Mustangs. They're protected. Protected on paper, Sarah corrected. But if horses are adopted through legal channels and then privately sold later, who's keeping track? She lowered her voice. There's more. One of my colleagues treated some horses from a film production last year. The wrangler mentioned that Whitmore Enterprises had approached them about supplying horses cheaply. When my colleague asked how they could undercut legitimate horse dealers, the wrangler just laughed and said, "Government subsidies." James's mind raced. If Whitmore is adopting these horses through strawmen, he gets paid the adoption incentive by the government. What is it, $1,000 per horse? Then either sells them for meat or rents them out commercially. And meanwhile, Sarah added, he's got a contract with the BLM to manage the overflow facilities, which I'm guessing is funded by taxpayer dollars. He's double-dipping, James realized, getting paid to keep the horses and then making money off them again by selling or renting them. If we're right, it's not just unethical, it's criminal. Sarah met his gaze. But proving it would be nearly impossible. You'd need documentation, witnesses willing to testify against a powerful man. The Mustang shifted in his sling, drawing their attention. Despite his condition, there was a dignity to the animal, a resilience that spoke to the wild spirit. These horses embodied. For generations, Mustangs had survived against incredible odds in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They were living symbols of the American West, protected by federal law because of their cultural and historical significance. I need to find Melissa, James decided. The woman from the BLM. She has access to the records, and she already suspects something's wrong. Be careful, Sarah warned. Whitmore doesn't strike me as the type to let someone interfere with his business. James nodded, but his determination was set. I'll come back to check on him later, he said, giving the Mustang a gentle pat. The horse didn't flinch away this time, a small victory. Outside the clinic, James called the BLM office asking for Melissa. The receptionist informed him that Melissa had called in sick today. When he pressed for her contact information, citing an urgent follow-up to his case, the receptionist became evasive and finally admitted she'd been instructed not to give out Melissa's information. That raised James's suspicions further. He drove to the local library, where he could use a public computer rather than his home network. Years of wildlife conservation work had taught him a healthy paranoia about powerful interests who didn't appreciate scrutiny. At the library, he searched public records for Melissa's last name, which he'd spotted on her full name badge, Melissa Dela Cruz. It didn't take long to find a listing for an M. Dela Cruz in Elko. It was a long shot, but worth trying. The address led him to a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of town. He knocked on the door of Unit 14, prepared for a stranger to answer. Instead, the door opened a crack, held by a security chain, and Melissa's frightened eyes peered out. "Mr. Morgan," she whispered, clearly surprised. "How did you find me?" "Phone book," he replied simply. "Can we talk?" She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "I shouldn't. They already suspect I accessed those files." Nevertheless, she closed the door, removed the chain, and let him in. The apartment was sparsely furnished but neat. Papers were spread. Across the dining table, printouts of what looked like official documents. "I called in sick because I needed time to gather these," she explained, gesturing to the papers. "After our conversation, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that horse in your photos, so I went in early, before anyone else, and printed everything I could find on the private holding facility contracts and the adoptions from the Silver King gather." James examined the documents. Most were bureaucratic forms filled with jargon, but several pages stood out. a contract between the BLM and Whitmore Enterprises for emergency equine housing services, adoption records with the same irregularities Melissa had mentioned on the phone, and what appeared to be transportation logs showing horses being moved between facilities. "This one," Melissa said, pointing to a specific adoption record, "is for your horse. The adopter is listed as Thomas Jenkins, with an address in Reno. But when I checked, there's no Thomas Jenkins at that address. The inspection reports show the horse passed all welfare checks right up until 6 months ago when the mandatory inspection period ended." "And Haskell signed off on all this?" James asked. Melissa nodded grimly. "He personally approved many of these adoptions, especially the ones with questionable documentation. That's unusual. Normally that's delegated to adoption coordinators." "What about the facility I saw? Is it in these records?" She rifled through the papers and pulled out several stapled sheets. "This is the contract for the auxiliary holding facility operated by Whitmore Enterprises. It's supposed to be temporary, just until population levels can be brought down through adoptions and transfers to long-term pastures. But look at the amendments." James scanned the documents. What had started as a 6-month emergency contract had been extended repeatedly for over 2 years. The terms were generous. Whitmore was being paid per horse per day, with minimal oversight requirements. "There's supposed to be monthly inspections," Melissa said, "but the inspection reports are vague, always signed by the same person, Harold Jennings. Let me guess, another Whitmore employee. I couldn't find much on him, but he doesn't appear on any BLM employee roster I have access to." James sat back, processing the information. "So Whitmore gets paid to house these horses, adopts them through fake identities or employees, collects the adoption incentive, then either sells them illegally for slaughter or rents them out for profit. And the BLM, or at least Haskell, is looking the other way. Or worse," Melissa added quietly. "The timing of Haskell's promotion to regional coordinator coincides with the first Whitmore contract, and he's purchased a vacation home and a U-boat in the last year on a government salary. The implication was clear: kickbacks. "I need to make copies of these," James said. "Already done." Melissa handed him a USB drive. "Everything's here, but Mr. Morgan, what are you going to do with this? Whitmore has connections everywhere, local government, state officials, even federal agencies. Who can you trust with this information?" It was a question James had been asking himself since discovering the facility. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Need you at the clinic. Urgent. Come alone." The tone was unlike Sarah, raising James's concern immediately. "I have to go," he told Melissa. "Keep these documents safe. And Melissa." "Thank you. You're taking a big risk." She gave a shaky smile. "That horse in your photos, the look in his eyes." "I've worked at the BLM because I believe in protecting these animals. If this is happening on my watch, I can't just ignore it." As James drove to Sarah's clinic, the USB drive secure in his pocket, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were escalating faster than he'd anticipated. If his suspicions about Whitmore and Haskell were correct, they wouldn't hesitate to protect their lucrative arrangement. The question was, how far would they go to keep their secret? The parking lot at Sarah's veterinary clinic was unusually empty when James arrived. Normally there would be at least a few trucks belonging to ranchers or pet owners, but today there was only Sarah's dusty Jeep. The open sign was turned off, despite it being the middle of the day. James approached. Cautiously, Sarah's cryptic text message replaying in his mind. Something felt off. He tried calling her cell phone, but got no answer. After a moment's hesitation, he used the spare key Sarah had given him when they'd brought the Mustang in. "In case you want to visit him while I'm out," she'd said. The clinic's reception area was dark and quiet. "Sarah?" James called out. reaching for the light switch. "In the back," Sarah's voice replied from the direction of the treatment rooms, "with our patient." James made his way to the Mustang's stall, relaxing slightly at the sound of Sarah's voice. The horse was still in his sling, but appeared more alert than earlier, his ears pricked forward at James's approach. What James hadn't expected was the man standing beside Sarah, Richard Haskell from the BLM. "Mr. Morgan," Haskell greeted him, with a thin smile. "Dr. Martinez was just giving me an update on this unfortunate animal." James shot a questioning look at Sarah, whose tight expression betrayed her discomfort. "Mr. Haskell arrived unannounced," she explained. "He said he needed to verify the horse's condition and identity for BLM records." "Did he?" James kept his voice neutral while his mind raced. The USB drive in his pocket felt suddenly heavier. "Find everything you need, Mr. Haskell?" "Almost." Haskell stepped away from the horse, moving closer to James. "Dr. Martinez has been very helpful, but I'm still trying to understand how this horse ended up on your property, Mr. Morgan. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? These animals typically collapse in remote areas when they're in distress, not on private porches." The implication was clear. Haskell suspected James of somehow being involved in the horse's condition. "No coincidence," James replied evenly. "My property borders open range. This horse was looking for help and found the nearest human habitation. Animals are smarter than people give them credit for." "Indeed," Haskell's gaze was calculating. "I understand you've been making inquiries about our adoption program, even visiting one of our contracted facilities." James felt a chill. He'd been careful not to be seen at Whitmore's facility, or so he thought. Either he'd been spotted, or Whitmore's security was better than he'd realized. "Just concerned about where this horse came from," James said. "Natural curiosity." "Curiosity. It can be dangerous," Haskell remarked, "especially when it involves misunderstandings about complex government programs." He turned to Sarah. "Thank you for your cooperation, Dr. Martinez. I'll need those treatment records for our files." "I'll email them to your office," Sarah replied, her tone professional but cool. "I prefer to take them now. They're not prepared yet. I'll send them when they're complete." Something in Sarah's stance told James she was standing her ground for a reason. Haskell seemed to sense it too, but didn't push further. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Very well. I'll expect them by end of day." He turned back to James. "Mr. Morgan, a word of advice. The wild horse program is rife with controversy and misunderstanding. People see a thin horse and assume neglect, when the reality is more complicated. These are wild animals in a harsh environment. Not every situation is as it appears." "I completely agree," James replied. "Things are rarely as they appear." The two men held each other's gaze for a long moment before Haskell nodded curtly and left. Sarah visibly relaxed once the door closed behind him. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "He just showed up demanding to see the horse. I didn't have grounds to refuse. Technically, the BLM still has jurisdiction over mustangs, even after adoption." "It's okay," James assured her. "But we need to be careful. I've got documentation." He patted his pocket. Melissa from the BLM came through. Records of suspicious adoptions, inspection reports that don't add up, the contract for Whitmore's facility with almost no oversight provisions. Sarah's eyes widened. "That text wasn't from me, James. I never sent you a message today." James felt the blood drain from his face. "Someone has your phone." "No, it's right here, but—" She checked her sent messages. "Nothing to you today. Someone spoofed my number." The implications hit them both simultaneously. They wanted you here while Haskell was here, Sarah realized. To see your reaction, maybe. Or to get me away from Melissa. James finished grimly. He pulled out his phone and tried calling. Her. No answer. We need to check on her. Now. They hurried to Sarah's Jeep, leaving her assistant in charge of the clinic and the Mustang. As they drove toward Melissa's apartment, James explained everything he'd learned from the BLM clerk. "This is bigger than horse neglect," Sarah said as she navigated the streets of Elko. "If they're falsifying federal records and misappropriating government funds, that's serious criminal territory. Not to mention the animal abuse and potential illegal slaughter," James added. When they arrived at Melissa's apartment complex, James immediately sensed something was wrong. The door to Unit 14 was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. "Melissa?" he called, pushing the door open fully. The apartment was in disarray, not the violent chaos of a struggle, but the methodical disorder of a search. The documents that had been spread across the dining table were gone. Drawers had been pulled out, the couch cushions removed, even air vents unscrewed from the walls. "They were looking for the documents," James said, "and the copies." "Where's Melissa?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with worry. A quick search of the apartment revealed no sign of the BLM clerk. Her purse was still there, phone and keys missing. In the bathroom, the medicine cabinet hung open, a few prescription bottles knocked over in haste. "We need to call the police," Sarah insisted. James hesitated. "And tell them what?" "That a woman is missing after giving us evidence of corruption, involving a powerful local businessman and a federal agency. Who's to say the local police aren't in Whitmore's pocket too? We can't just do nothing." "We're not." James pulled out the USB drive. "We have what they were looking for. We need to get this to someone we can trust, someone outside Whitmore's sphere of influence." Sarah considered this. "I have a college friend who works for the Department of the Interior's Inspector General's office in Denver. They oversee the BLM. Would that work?" "Perfect. Can you contact her?" "Not from here," Sarah said, looking around the apartment uneasily. "We should go." As they left the apartment, James noticed a neighbor peering out through a partially open door across the hall. "Excuse me," he called out. "We're friends of Melissa's. Have you seen her today?" The elderly woman regarded them suspiciously. "Are you with those other men?" James and Sarah exchanged glances. "What other men?" Sarah asked. "Two men in suits," the woman replied. "They came a couple hours ago. There was some kind of argument. I heard Melissa yelling that they had no right to take her things." "Did you see her leave?" James pressed. "They all left together. She didn't look happy about it, but she went. One of them had his hand on her arm. Not rough exactly, but—" The woman frowned. "I asked if everything was all right. The man said Melissa was helping them with an investigation, showed me some kind of badge, but too quick for me to see what it was." James thanked the woman and walked with Sarah back to her Jeep. "They're trying to contain this," he said once they were inside. "Haskell was keeping you occupied, while someone, probably Whitmore's men, dealt with Melissa and her evidence." "What do they want with her?" "Best case, they're just holding her somewhere until they figure out if she made copies. Worst case." He didn't finish the thought. Sarah started the engine. "My friend in Denver, she's our best shot, but it's a 5-hour drive. Too risky by road," James decided. "They could be watching for your Jeep or my truck. Is there a flight?" Sarah checked her phone. "One small commuter flight daily to Denver. Leaves in 3 hours. That's our best option, but we can't go home first. They might be watching our places too." "So we go straight to the airport?" James considered their options. "First, we need to make a copy of this USB drive. Insurance. Then yes, one of us needs to get on that plane." "One of us?" "I can't leave," James said firmly. "The Mustang is still critical, and Melissa is missing. I need to keep looking for her while you get this evidence to your friend in Denver." Sarah didn't look happy about the plan, but nodded in agreement. "What about the copy? Where do we leave it?" James thought for a moment. "Somewhere no one would think to look." A slow smile spread across his face. and I know just the place. They drove to a local electronics store, where James purchased another USB drive and quickly made a copy of the files. Then they headed for Sarah's clinic. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked as they hurried through the back entrance. "It's the last place they'd look," James insisted, moving to the Mustang's stall. The horse regarded them calmly as James approached. From his pocket, he pulled out a small waterproof bag containing the duplicate USB drive, then carefully attached it to the inside of the horse's halter, concealed by the padded headpiece. "Our secret keeper," James murmured, stroking the Mustang's neck. The horse blinked slowly, as if understanding the importance of his new role. With the copy secured, James and Sarah discussed their next steps. She would fly to Denver with the original USB drive, while James would continue investigating locally, trying to locate Melissa and gather any additional evidence. "Be careful," Sarah said as she prepared to leave for the airport. "These people have already shown they're willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their operation." "You too," James replied. "Call me when you land, from a payphone if you can find one. I think we have to assume our phones might be monitored." As Sarah drove away, James turned back to the Mustang. "Looks like it's just you and me now, partner," he said quietly. "And we've got work to do." The horse nickered softly in response, his once dull eyes now showing a spark of the wild spirit that had helped him survive against all odds. James couldn't help but feel that same spirit would be needed in the days ahead for both of them. After Sarah left for the airport, James faced a dilemma. He needed to investigate Melissa's disappearance without drawing attention if Whitmore and Haskell were watching him. First, he ensured the Mustang's safety by asking Eleanor, Sarah's assistant, to keep the case off digital records. "It's complicated," James admitted when she looked skeptical. "There are people who might not have this horse's best interests at heart." Elena studied him before nodding. "That BLM guy who came by? I didn't like how he looked at that horse, like it was a problem to be solved, not an animal to be saved. Can I trust you to keep an extra eye on him? Call me if anyone comes asking, especially Haskell or anyone from Whitmore Enterprises." "Whitmore?" Elena's expression darkened. "My cousin worked for their mining operation, got fired after raising safety concerns. They're bad news." She straightened. "Don't worry about the horse. I'll stay late and brief the overnight tech personally." Next, James visited the Elko Free Press to meet environmental reporter Diane Yazzie, whom he knew from previous wildlife conservation work. "James Morgan," she greeted him. "What brings you to my messy little corner of the world?" "I need information off the record. Have you heard anything about unusual activities at the BLM? Specifically, the Wild Horse program?" Diane leaned forward. "I've been working on something related to that for months. No one will go on record." She studied him. "You have something?" "Maybe. But first, any reports of a missing woman, Melissa De La Cruz from the BLM?" Diane checked her computer. "Our crime reporter's source says there was an incident at an apartment complex this morning, handled by federal agents, not local police." Federal agents? What agency?" Deputies weren't told, just that it was a federal matter. "What do you know about Carson Whitmore's connections to the BLM?" "Whitmore Enterprises has had its tentacles in the BLM for years. Mining rights, grazing allotments, now wild horse contracts. Those contracts are worth millions with minimal oversight." "And Richard Haskell?" "His promotion to regional coordinator came right after approving Whitmore's first horse contract. Now he's driving a new truck and building a vacation home on Lake Tahoe." James decided to share partial information. "I found a Mustang near death on my property. Following the trail led me to a Whitmore facility housing wild horses in appalling conditions and documents suggesting adoption fraud. Do you still have these documents?" "They're safe, but Melissa who helped me access them, has disappeared, possibly taken by men claiming to be federal agents. James asked Diane to use her sources to gather information about unusual activity at Whitmore's facilities and to monitor Haskell's movements. At Melissa's apartment complex, James noticed a black SUV matching Whitmore's parked across the street. They were watching the apartment, suggesting they hadn't found all the evidence yet. James parked blocks away and approached via alleyways. Using a multi-tool, he jimmied the service entrance lock and made his way to Melissa's unit. Searching methodically, he found a framed photograph with an unusually thick backing. Inside was a mini SD card. As he prepared to leave, voices outside. The front door forced him to hide in the bathroom. He escaped through a window as men entered the apartment. At a public library in the next town, James accessed the card's contents, an encrypted file protected by password. After several attempts, Francis Assisi worked the name of a church in the photograph. The files contained damning evidence, clear photos from inside Whitmore's facility showing overcrowded pens, emaciated horses, and abuse. Financial records showing payments from the BLM to Whitmore, alongside transactions to a Mexican company called Equine Processing Solutions, and emails between Haskell and Whitmore discussing bribes and processing horses with minimal oversight. James saved copies to a new USB drive. This evidence, combined with what Sarah was taking to Denver, would be impossible to dismiss. His phone buzzed with a text. "Package delivered safely. Friend is very interested. Proceeding as discussed. Stay safe." Sarah had reached her contact at the Inspector General's office. Now James needed to locate Melissa and keep himself and the Mustang safe until authorities could move against Whitmore and Haskell. As he left the library, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled in. The timing was too coincidental. James took a different exit, watching his rearview mirror as the vehicle made a U-turn and began following. Whitmore's reach was long indeed, and James had just become a target. Now James drove toward downtown, where he could lose the black sedan following him. After several deliberate turns through side streets, he slipped into a crowded mall parking garage, abandoned his truck, and exited through a department store. From a diner across the street, he watched two men in dark suits emerge from the mall, scanning the area with frustration. Using the diner's phone, he called Eleanor at the clinic. "Any visitors?" "All quiet here," she assured him. "The Mustang, it's a mash on his own." "Have you heard from Sarah?" "Not since she left for that conference in Denver," Elena replied, emphasizing the cover story. "I might not be able to come by tonight. If anyone asks about me, you're helping with a wildlife survey in the Rubies," she finished. "Already covered." James gave her Diane's number to call if strangers came asking about the horse. Now, he needed different transportation. His solution, Manny Rodriguez, whose daughter James had helped with wildlife education years ago. At Rodriguez Auto Repair, Manny recognized him immediately. "James Morgan, been a while." After catching up, briefly, James explained his situation vaguely. "I need to borrow a vehicle for a couple of days. I can't return to my truck right now." "This about those wild horses Lucia mentioned, rumors of mistreatment." "Yes," James admitted, "but it goes deeper. I can't say more, for your safety." Manny soon returned with keys to his brother's Jeep Cherokee. "Be careful, amigo. Lucia would never forgive me if something happened to her wildlife hero." With transportation secured, James needed a place to review Melissa's evidence. A text from Diane provided temporary direction. "Need to talk. Info on M's whereabouts. Usual spot, 7 p.m. Until then, James drove to a lookout road in the hills, where he could examine the SD card without being observed. The files revealed Melissa had been documenting corruption for months. Photos with GPS data from multiple Whitmore facilities, records of systematic neglect, and shipping manifests showing horses being sent to Mexico for slaughter. A video caught his attention. Melissa appeared on screen, her voice steady despite fear in her eyes. "I'm recording this as insurance. If you're viewing this, something may have happened to me." She detailed the Whitmore-Haskell operation, fraudulent adoptions, kickbacks, and illegal slaughter. Richard Haskell has approved over 800 fraudulent adoptions to Whitmore-controlled entities. In return, he's received at least $175,000 in consulting fees. The timestamp showed the video was recorded just one day before James found the Mustang. Had Melissa somehow arranged for the horse to find him? After backing up the files, James headed to meet Diane. At the coffee shop, she shared her information. Those federal agents who took Melissa filed paperwork for temporary use of a holding cell at the county jail. She was transferred this afternoon, and my source overheard something about White Pine. White Pine Ranch, James realized, Whitmore's personal property, thousands of acres, very private. He hosts political fundraisers there. Why would federal agents take a BLM employee to Whitmore's ranch? Either they're not real federal agents, or the corruption goes higher than the local BLM office. James decided to investigate the ranch personally. Diane showed him satellite images and mentioned a possible access route through national forest land. "This is risky, James. Whitmore's security is serious. Former military contractors." As they talked, a news alert appeared on Diane's laptop. BLM employee dead in single vehicle accident. The article mentioned a car found in a ravine belonging to a female BLM employee. "They're trying to tie up loose ends," James said grimly. "If Melissa is still at the ranch, that accident report might be laying groundwork to explain her death." Diane promised to investigate the accident while James headed for White Pine Ranch. Sarah texted, "Evidence delivered. Official investigation. Opening, stay safe, wait for backup." But James couldn't wait. If Melissa was at the ranch, every hour was critical. He would rely on his skills as a wildlife researcher, observation, patience, and moving quietly through wilderness to gather information without detection. As he drove south under the stars, he thought of the Mustang fighting for its life back at Sarah's clinic. James would need that same stubborn will to survive what lay ahead. Following Diane's directions, James drove along the loneliest road in America toward White Pine Ranch. After turning onto progressively smaller roads, he reached the edge of national forest land bordering Whitmore's property. He parked his borrowed Jeep in a grove of pinyons, concealing it from view. The moonless night provided perfect cover. He gathered essential supplies, binoculars, flashlight, water, his phone in airplane mode, and a hunting knife. Using an offline hiking app, he navigated through the dark forest, his wildlife fieldwork experience guiding him silently across the rugged terrain. 30 minutes later, he found a dirt service road showing recent tire tracks. Following it at a distance under tree cover, James eventually spotted lights in the valley below. White Pine Ranch sprawled across the landscape, much larger than he'd anticipated. The main house sat atop a low rise, surrounded by multiple outbuildings, barns, and staff housing. The property's security was impressive, a gated entrance with guardhouse and regular patrol vehicles. Through his binoculars, James methodically scanned the property. Most buildings appeared normal for a working ranch, but one structure stood out, a small cabin set apart from the others with a security guard posted outside. Unlike the other buildings with multiple lights, only a single dim light showed inside this cabin. The guard wasn't patrolling, but stationed directly at the door. James worked closer, using terrain for cover and avoiding security cameras. From behind a maintenance shed, he watched the guard, alert, professional, communicating via radio. This wasn't a casual assignment. This was serious security. A vehicle approached, an SUV similar to those that had followed him earlier. Two men exited and spoke briefly with the guard before entering the cabin. Through his binoculars, James recognized Richard Haskell from the BLM. The second man, older with silver hair, was unmistakably Carson Whitmore. Their presence at this isolated, guarded cabin confirmed his suspicions. After 20 minutes inside, they emerged. Whitmore gave instructions to the guard, while Haskell appeared agitated, checking his watch nervously. James took photos despite the poor lighting conditions. After they departed, the property settled into routine, the guard remaining vigilant at his post. Shortly after midnight, James got his confirmation. A ranch hand approached with a food tray. The guard checked it before unlocking the door. Through his binoculars, James glimpsed the interior, a simple room with a bed and chair, occupied by a dark-haired woman whose appearance matched Melissa's. The setup confirmed someone was being held captive. No guest would require a locked door and armed guard. Having documented everything, James retreated carefully. As he returned to his vehicle and briefly disabled airplane mode, a text from Sarah appeared. IG agent taking evidence seriously, asking about your whereabouts. Call this number ASAP. Back at the Jeep, James transferred the photos to his laptop, made backup copies, and composed an email to Sarah and Diane with instructions to release everything to media if they didn't hear from him within 24 hours. After sending it, he called the number Sarah provided. Special Agent Marquez, a woman, answered despite the late hour. This is James Morgan. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I believe Sarah Martinez contacted you about corruption in the BLM Wild Horse program. Mr. Morgan, we've been trying to reach you. Where are you currently? Remaining cautious, James asked, are you aware Melissa Dela Cruz is being held at Carson Whitmore's ranch? After a pause, we have information about her potential abduction. How do you know her location? I've just observed White Pine Ranch. I have photos of a guarded cabin where someone matching Melissa's description is being held. I also documented Haskell visiting with Whitmore tonight. What you're describing is a serious federal crime. Marquez replied urgently, we need your evidence immediately. I'm prepared to provide it, but I need certain guarantees. There's also a news report of a BLM employee in a fatal accident. I'm concerned it may be groundwork for explaining Melissa's disappearance. The accident is being investigated as a potential staging. I understand your caution, but time is critical. They arranged to meet at an all-night diner. Before leaving, James called Elena for an update on the Mustang. He's holding his own, she reported. Actually ate some hay tonight. Elena also mentioned a suspicious call from someone claiming to be from Wildlife Services, asking about James's whereabouts. She had deliberately been vague. At the diner, Agent Marquez arrived in a government sedan. After examining James's evidence, she confirmed, this is significant. Combined with the financial records, we have enough for warrants. How quickly can you move? James asked. A team is assembling in Reno now. We're coordinating with the FBI since this crosses multiple jurisdictions. Given Whitmore's local connections, we're using federal resources only, no local involvement. Marquez requested James accompany her to Reno to help plan the approach. Though concerned about the Mustang, James agreed, knowing Melissa's safety was the priority. As they drove toward Reno, James reflected on how a single starving horse had led to uncovering corruption, reaching into federal agencies. Before losing cell service, he received a text from Diane. Evidence secured, story ready when you give the word. If something went wrong, at least the truth would still come out. For the Mustang, for Melissa, and for hundreds of suffering horses, There would be justice, one way or another. Before dawn, James sat in a secure conference room at the federal building in Reno, describing White Pine Ranch's layout to a team of agents. Using satellite imagery, he indicated the guarded cabin where he'd spotted Melissa, along with access points and security measures. The main approach is heavily monitored, he explained, but the service road from the east has minimal coverage. That's how I got close undetected. Agent Marquez and FBI agent Torres, who was leading the tactical operation, listened intently. Torres asked detailed questions about guard rotations and camera placements. Our primary concern is Ms. De La Cruz's safety, Torres emphasized. Do you believe she's in immediate danger? They've gone to significant lengths to isolate her, James answered. And there's the staged car accident, potentially laying groundwork to explain her death. The longer she's held, the greater the risk, especially if Whitmore suspects authorities are closing in. Which is why we need to move quickly, Marquez added. Warrants should be approved within hours. By mid-morning, the operation had taken shape. 3 teams would execute simultaneous warrants, one at White Pine Ranch to secure Melissa and arrest Whitmore, another at the BLM offices for Haskell, and a third at the holding facility to document conditions and begin processing the animals. Torres asked James to accompany them in an advisory capacity, remaining with the command vehicle until the property was secured. James agreed without hesitation. As they prepared to leave, Marquez took James aside. We've been investigating Whitmore for some time, not just for the wild horse program, but for a pattern of corruption involving public lands. Your evidence may finally give us what we need to bring charges that will stick. You already suspected him? Whitmore has powerful friends. Previous investigations were shut down from above. This time we've kept it compartmentalized, with direct oversight from Washington. Within the hour, they were moving out. The tactical team established a command post in a canyon 2 miles from the ranch. Both targets are on the property, Torres informed them. Aerial surveillance shows minimal activity. James watched through monitoring equipment as the operation began. The teams moved with practiced efficiency, using the terrain for cover. The first sign of activity came when the security cameras went dark. Alpha team in position at the cabin, came a voice over the radio. 1 guard outside, proceeding with entry. James held his breath as he watched the grainy body cam footage. The guard was quickly subdued, and the team breached the door. Female subject located, identity confirmed as Melissa De La Cruz. She is alive, appears unharmed. Relief washed over James. Bravo team at main house. Subject Whitmore is not in residence. Staff reports he left 20 minutes ago toward the eastern property line. Torres frowned. That's the direction of the service road. Did someone tip him off? Another voice cut in. Vehicle matching Whitmore's SUV, moving at high speed toward the forest boundary. He's running, Torres said grimly. Delta team, intercept the vehicle. James pointed to a narrow pass on the topographical map. There's only one way out of those ravines by vehicle. Everything else is too steep. Torres dispatched agents with James to establish a blockade at the pass. Minutes later, James found himself in an SUV racing along a dirt track. They reached the narrow gap between rocky hillsides and positioned their vehicle across it. Stay in the vehicle, Mr. Morgan, Agent Jackson ordered. Tense minutes passed, then came the rumble of an engine echoing through the ravines. Whitmore's SUV appeared and skidded to a halt upon seeing the blockade. Carson Whitmore, this is the FBI. You are surrounded. Exit the vehicle with your hands visible. After several seconds, Whitmore emerged, still maintaining his air of authority, despite looking disheveled. This is a misunderstanding, he called out. I'm a private citizen on my own property. We have federal warrants for your arrest. Whitmore didn't move. Whatever you think you know, you're mistaken. One phone call and this all goes away. Even cornered, the man believed himself untouchable. The standoff ended when a helicopter appeared overhead. Realizing he had no escape, Whitmore finally surrendered. "You," he said coldly when he noticed James, "the wildlife researcher, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." "Just helping a horse that needed it," James replied. "Everything else you brought on yourself." At the command post, James found Melissa being examined by medical personnel. When she spotted him, relief flooded her face. "You found me," she said simply. "How?" "Your video testimony led us here," James explained. "It's over. Whitmore and Haskell are both in custody." Melissa looked at him urgently. "The horse, the one from my video. Did he survive?" "He's still fighting at Sarah's clinic." "I hoped he'd find help," she said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't save them all, but I thought if even one could get out, could show the world what was happening." She explained how she'd left a gate unsecured during a shift change. He was one of the few still strong enough to move. "I guided him toward the perimeter and hoped." "How did he end up at my place specifically?" "Your conservation work. I'd researched who might help if I gathered evidence. Your name came up as someone who would ask questions, not just call animal control. It was a desperate plan. I didn't think it would actually work." Throughout the day, the operation expanded as teams secured evidence from Whitmore's properties. At the holding facility, veterinarians documented conditions and began arranging care for the neglected horses. That night, James sat on a ridge overlooking the ranch, now bustling with law enforcement activity. His phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Story running tomorrow. Front page. Justice for the mustangs." The word resonated as James gazed at the landscape where wild horses had roamed for centuries. The mustang that had collapsed on his doorstep had been a messenger, carrying evidence of exploitation on his very body. In the morning, he would return to Elko, to the clinic where the mustang continued his recovery. For now, under the vast Nevada stars, James allowed himself to feel quiet satisfaction. Sometimes, against all odds, justice could prevail. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Federal investigations expanded beyond Nevada as Whitmore's operation was exposed across multiple states, all involving corrupt officials and horses sent to slaughter across borders. James divided his time between testimony and visiting Sarah's clinic. After Diane's front-page story broke, donations poured in for the Mustang's care. A local artist even painted a mural of him on a downtown building captioned simply, "Messenger." The name stuck, and the horse seemed to respond to it. 16 days after the raid, James arrived at the clinic to find Sarah waiting outside the stall. "He's ready," she announced. "Come see." Inside, Messenger stood without his supportive sling for the first time. Though still thin, his coat had begun to regain its luster, and his eyes now held an alert, intelligent gaze. The wounds were healing, leaving scars that would tell his story but no longer caused pain. "I can hardly believe it's the same horse," James said. Messenger extended his muzzle, sniffing James's hand before allowing him to stroke his neck. This simple gesture of trust brought an unexpected lump to James's throat. "His recovery has been remarkable," Sarah agreed. "Physically, he needs months to regain strength, but mentally, most horses would be traumatized beyond rehabilitation after his experiences, yet he's chosen to trust again." "What happens to him now, and to the others from Whitmore's facilities? That's why I asked you here." Agent Marquez called. "The court appointed a special master for the rescued horses. They want our input on Messenger, given his unique role." "What are the options?" "Several BLM-approved sanctuaries have offered to take the horses. They'd live in protected herds, with proper care." Sarah hesitated. "There's also discussion about returning some to the wild, though that's complicated." James considered this. The idea of Messenger returning to the wild was appealing, but unrealistic. After captivity and treatment, many formerly wild horses struggled to readapt to range life. What do you think is best for him? Honestly, neither option feels right. Sarah entered the stall, checking Messenger's legs. He's not a typical wild mustang anymore. His recovery has created bonds. At a sanctuary, he'd be just another rescue case. James understood. Messenger had become more than just a horse to them. A survivor, a whistleblower, the catalyst that exposed corruption. There is a third option, Sarah continued. He could be officially adopted by someone who understands his history and special needs. The implication hung between them. James had never considered himself a horse owner. Me? Sarah, I don't know the first thing about caring for a horse. You know more than you think. You two have a connection. Anyone can see it. I'd still be his vet, and Elena has volunteered to help until you get the hang of it. James looked at Messenger, who gently nudged his shoulder with his muzzle. I'll think about it, he promised. Later, Agent Marquez called with updates. Whitmore was seeking a plea deal, and Haskell was cooperating, implicating higher officials. The corruption extended to congressional staffers who had shielded the operation. The publicity has put a spotlight on the entire wild horse program, Marquez explained. There's talk of reforms to prevent future abuse. And Melissa? Recovering. Well, she's declined witness protection, wanting to see reforms through personally. James drove to his property, 15 acres of sagebrush and pinyon pines. He walked the perimeter, mentally calculating needs, fencing, shelter, water troughs. The idea of providing a home for Messenger felt right, not as a pet, but as a fellow survivor. The next day, Melissa met James for coffee. Despite shadows under her eyes, her determination remained strong. She'd been offered a promotion to oversee the adoption program. Someone needs to make sure this never happens again, she explained. The system failed those horses. I want to be part of fixing it. When James mentioned possibly adopting Messenger, her face lit up. That would be perfect. When I helped him escape, I never imagined knowing what happened to him. Her voice caught with emotion. He'd have a home with someone who understands. It's a big commitment, James cautioned. Some commitments find us, Melissa replied. That horse found you for a reason. At the hearing for the disposition of seized horses, James spoke with unexpected certainty. This horse traveled miles in a desperate state to find help. Not just for himself, but for hundreds of others. He deserves a life of dignity and purpose. His adoption application was approved with specific conditions. On the day Messenger arrived at his property, perfect Nevada weather welcomed them, clear skies and the scent of sagebrush. When the trailer opened, Messenger cautiously explored his new surroundings. After investigating the corral, water, and the Mustang approached James and gently rested his head against the man's chest, a gesture of complete trust. I think he's approved, Sarah said softly. That evening, James received news of Whitmore's plea deal. Reforms were already being implemented in the wild horse program, with Melissa working directly with the Inspector General's office. Later, as James checked on Messenger one last time, he found the horse gazing toward distant mountains. For a moment, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. Then Messenger turned, nickering softly as James approached, extending his neck over the fence. Welcome home, Messenger, James said quietly. In the Mustang's dark eyes, James saw not resignation to captivity, but acceptance of sanctuary, a different kind of freedom from fear, hunger, and abuse. Under the vast Nevada sky, horse and man stood together, two lives forever changed by their encounter. Messenger had delivered his message. Even one horse standing against injustice could spark change, and James had carried that message forward until the truth could no longer be hidden. 3 months after Messenger came to live at James's property, the changes in both horse and home were remarkable. The small corral had expanded into a proper paddock with a substantial shelter and 5 acres of mixed terrain for the Mustang to explore. Messenger's transformation was striking. His once skeletal frame now carried healthy muscle, and his coat gleamed in the autumn sunlight. The scars remained, permanent reminders of his ordeal, but they no longer defined him. Where a desperate animal had once stood, a vibrant, alert Mustang now surveyed his domain with quiet confidence. "I hardly recognize him," Sarah remarked during an October visit. "His blood work is normal, weight is excellent, and his muscle tone is better than I'd hoped." "He's a fighter," James agreed, watching Messenger investigate a new puzzle feeder. Rather than imposing traditional training methods, James had developed an approach that honored the horse's wild nature. He demonstrated by walking to the center of the paddock and standing quietly. After a moment, Messenger approached, circling James before stopping nearby. No halter or lead rope, just mutual respect. "It's unorthodox," Sarah acknowledged, "but it works for both of you." Later, Agent Marquez called with good news. Whitmore's sentencing was scheduled for the following week, with an expected 15-20 years imprisonment. As part of the plea agreement, his assets were being liquidated to fund care for the rescued horses. "White Pine Ranch is being forfeited to the government," Marquez explained. "There's talk of converting it into a wild horse education center and rehabilitation facility with oversight from the reformed BLM program." "Poetic justice," James remarked. "The planning committee would like your input on rehabilitation aspects, given your experience with Messenger. Would you be willing to consult?" James agreed, surprised by this new direction his life was taking. The following week, Melissa visited to see Messenger for the first time since his rescue. Tears welled in her eyes as the healthy horse approached to investigate her. "I can't believe it's him," she said. "When I last saw him, I wasn't sure he'd survive another day." She shared updates on the reforms to the wild horse program. Under her guidance, the adoption process had been restructured with stringent screening and follow-up inspections. "People need to understand these horses, their history, their ecological role, the challenges of managing them humanely," she explained. "The more transparent we are, the more public support we'll have for doing it." "Right." As a thank you, she presented James with a hand-carved wooden plaque bearing Messenger's name and a silhouette of a running Mustang, which he mounted on the horse's shelter. In December, a legal challenge threatened the reforms Melissa had implemented. A coalition of commercial interests filed a lawsuit claiming the new regulations created undue burden on public lands management. "They're trying to dismantle everything we've built," Melissa told James. "Would you and Messenger be willing to participate in a documentary? Your story puts a face on why these reforms matter." After consultation with Sarah about potential impacts on Messenger's well-being, James agreed to limited participation. The documentary team filmed Messenger's daily routines and the trust that had developed between him and James. "This isn't just about exposing corruption," the director explained. "It's about America's relationship with wild horses, our responsibility to them as living symbols of our heritage." By spring, the legal challenges had been largely defeated. The documentary, titled Messenger Saving the Wild Ones, was set to premiere at a film festival before airing nationally. In April, Melissa arrived with 2 new horses, a grey mare named Sierra and her colt, both rescued from Whitmore's facilities. James's property had been selected as part of a foster paddock network, where recovering Mustangs could transition from institutional care to more home-like environments. "We're particularly interested in how Messenger might model behavior for them," Melissa explained. "He's made remarkable progress in human interaction without losing his essential nature." The integration went smoothly, with Messenger assuming a calm leadership role. The success led to James's property becoming a permanent transition site in the rehabilitation network. 1 year after finding the starving Mustang on his doorstep, James watched what had become an unlikely family. Messenger now moved with the dignity of a banned stallion, leading Sierra and her colt through their daily routines. 2 additional rescued Mustangs had joined them, each healing and finding their place. As sunset painted the mountains in gold and crimson, James reflected on his unexpected journey. What had begun with basic compassion for a suffering animal had expanded into a mission helping transform an entire system. The Mustang who had stumbled onto his porch had indeed been a messenger not just of corruption, but of the possibility for healing when people chose to listen and act. 6 months after Whitmore's arrest, James stood in the witness box of the federal courthouse in Reno. The prosecution had called him to testify about finding Messenger and the subsequent investigation. The courtroom was packed with media, animal rights activists, and concerned citizens following what had become known nationally as the Mustang corruption case. "And the horse's condition when you found him?" the prosecutor asked. "Near death," James replied. "Severely malnourished, with evidence of physical abuse. Our veterinarian wasn't sure he would survive the night." As James described discovering the holding facility and the rescue operation at White Pine Ranch, he spotted Melissa in the gallery. Her testimony earlier in the week had been powerful and unwavering, despite aggressive cross-examination from Whitmore's defense team. The trial had revealed corruption extending far beyond Nevada. 3 more BLM officials had been indicted in neighboring states. Congressional hearings were underway to reform the entire wild horse management program, with Melissa serving as a key advisor. Whitmore sat stone-faced between his attorneys, his empire crumbling around him. Financial records had exposed not just horse-related crimes, but tax evasion, bribery of officials, and environmental violations at his mining operations. Haskell had accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony, along with several other co-conspirators. After court adjourned for the day, Melissa joined James outside. "How much longer do you think the trial will run?" he asked. "Prosecution expects to wrap up next week. With the evidence and testimony they have, conviction seems certain." She looked exhausted, but determined. "How's Messenger doing?" James smiled. "Come see for yourself. Sarah's bringing him to the Wild Horse Education Center tomorrow for the opening ceremony. You should join us." The center, formerly White Pine Ranch, had been transformed into a rehabilitation facility and educational space dedicated to wild horse preservation. The federal government had allocated the property and resources as part of the settlement of the case. The next morning, James arrived early at the center. Workers were putting final touches on exhibits explaining the Mustang's history and ecological role. In the central courtyard, a bronze statue had been installed, a wild horse, in full gallop, breaking free from chains. The plaque read, "Messenger, one horse's journey that changed the system." Sarah arrived with Messenger in a specially equipped trailer. The Mustang who had stumbled onto James's porch now stood proud and healthy, his coat gleaming in the morning sun. Though still bearing scars, they were now simply part of his story rather than his identity. As visitors began arriving for the ceremony, Messenger calmly accepted their attention from his paddock, occasionally nickering when he recognized familiar faces. Several other rehabilitated Mustangs from Whitmore's facilities were also on display, including Sierra and her now yearling colt, who had become part of James's growing herd. The ceremony began with remarks from the Secretary of the Interior, who had flown in specifically for the occasion. "What happened here represents both a failure of oversight and a triumph of individual courage," she said, "because one person refused to look away because one horse found the strength to seek help, we've uncovered and dismantled a criminal enterprise that exploited both animals and the public trust. Melissa was honored for her whistleblowing, receiving a standing ovation as she approached the podium. "I simply did what anyone with conscience would do," she said. "The real heroes are the horses who endured unimaginable suffering, and people like James and Sarah who answered their call for help." The most powerful moment came when James led Messenger into the demonstration area. Gasps rippled through the crowd at the transformation from the skeletal horse seen in the evidence photos to the magnificent animal before them. James removed the lead rope, allowing Messenger to move freely in the space. Rather than running to the far end, the Mustang chose to stay near James, occasionally nudging his shoulder in their now familiar gesture of connection. James demonstrated their unique relationship based on mutual respect rather than dominance. He explained the approach they developed, which was now being implemented with other traumatized horses in the rehabilitation program. As the crowd applauded, a reporter asked, "What happens to Messenger now? Will he stay at the center?" "No," James replied. "Messenger has a permanent home with me, but he'll visit regularly as an ambassador, helping people understand these remarkable animals." The real success story wasn't just Messenger's recovery or Whitmore's prosecution. It was the systematic change now underway. New legislation had been introduced strengthening protections for wild horses. The adoption program had been completely restructured under Melissa's guidance. Most importantly, public awareness had soared, with thousands following Messenger's story and supporting wild horse conservation efforts. That evening, as the sun set over the facility that had once housed corruption and now stood for education and rehabilitation, James watched Messenger graze peacefully alongside other rescued horses. From near death to national symbol, the Mustang's journey had come full circle. Tomorrow they would return home, back to the quiet property where their shared story began. But their work would continue. Messenger as a living ambassador for his wild kin, and James as a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. 2 years after the trial, James stood at the fence of his expanded property, watching his small herd of rescued Mustangs grazing in the morning light. What had begun with one starving horse had evolved into a specialized rehabilitation sanctuary for the most traumatized survivors from Whitmore's operation. Messenger, now the undisputed leader of the herd, lifted his head at James's arrival. Their bond had deepened into a partnership built on mutual trust and respect. Though fully recovered physically, Messenger would always carry the emotional memory of his ordeal, which he'd transformed into an ability to calm and guide other traumatized horses. James heard tires on gravel and turned to see Melissa's truck approaching. Since the trial, she had become the national director of the reformed Wild Horse and Burro program, implementing changes she'd once only dreamed of. Her monthly visits provided valuable data for rehabilitation protocols across the system. "They're looking good," she said, joining him at the fence, "especially the new mare." James nodded toward a dappled gray, keeping to the edge of the herd. Snowfall's still wary of humans, but Messenger's been working his magic. Yesterday, she actually took hay from Elena's hand. 2 weeks ago, she wouldn't let anyone within 20 feet, Melissa marveled. "Your methods are proving more effective than traditional approaches." The Messenger method, as it had been dubbed in equine rehabilitation circles, emphasized patience, choice, and natural herd dynamics. Videos of James and Messenger working with traumatized horses had gone viral, attracting attention from specialists. Worldwide, they walked toward the house where Sarah waited with coffee and the latest blood work from the quarterly checkups. The three had formed an effective team, James providing daily care, Sarah ensuring medical oversight, and Melissa connecting their work to broader systemic reform. The documentary crew confirmed for next week, Sarah mentioned. National Geographic wants to feature Messenger's story in their series on animal intelligence. The attention sometimes made James uncomfortable, but he recognized its value in maintaining public support for wild horse protection. As they discussed plans for new rehabilitation spaces, Melissa's phone rang. Her expression turned serious as she listened. "That was my contact at Interior," she said, after hanging up. "The Senate just passed the Wild Horse Protection Act. It's going to the President for signature next week." They fell silent, absorbing the news. The legislation, born directly from the Whitmore scandal, would permanently strengthen protections for wild horses, ban transport for slaughter, and establish sustainable management practices based on science rather than economic interests. 2 years ago, I was documenting crimes I thought no one would believe, Melissa said, her voice thick with emotion. Now we've changed the entire system. You changed it, James corrected. We all did, Sarah interjected. But let's not forget who started it all. She nodded toward Messenger, who had wandered closer, watching their conversation with intelligent eyes. That evening, after Melissa and Sarah departed, James spent time with each horse in the herd. The newest arrivals still showed signs of their ordeal, fear of sudden movements, reluctance to eat when humans were present. But improvement week by week was remarkable. Last, he came to Messenger, who waited at the gate of his paddock. This had become their evening ritual. Time alone together. No training, just companionship. Sometimes they simply stood together watching the sunset. Other evenings, like tonight, Messenger would initiate movement, inviting James to walk with him in a shared meditation. As darkness fell, James sat on a boulder while Messenger grazed nearby. His phone buzzed with a text from Diane, finished advance copy of the book. Your story with Messenger made me cry. In a good way. Publication next month. The book, chronicling the Whitmore case and the ongoing journey of Messenger, represented the final chapter of their investigative work. All proceeds would support the sanctuary and conservation efforts. In the distance, wild mustangs still roamed the Nevada ranges, now better protected than ever before. Messenger would never return to that life. His path had led elsewhere. But his legacy extended to those distant herds, ensuring their freedom for generations to come. As stars appeared above the desert landscape, Messenger returned to James's side, nickering softly. The mustang who had collapsed at death's door had become not just a survivor, but a healer, not just a rescued animal, but a partner in creating change. James rested his hand on Messenger's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath his palm. We did it, partner, he said softly. The mustang's ears flicked forward, dark eyes reflecting starlight as he gazed at the horizon, where the land met the sky, where captivity met freedom in a new definition of both. Together, they had transformed a story of exploitation and suffering into one of justice, recovery, and hope. Two souls connected by circumstance, choice, and the understanding that sometimes the most unlikely messengers bring the most important truths. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.